Diana's heart raced as she stood still, her instincts screaming that something was wrong, even though she wanted to believe it was just the house settling. Before we begin, I want to ask you something. Are you ready to hear a story that could change the way you see life? If your answer is yes, then let's begin right now, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss any new updates. Diana had always believed that love was something you grew into, like filling a favorite sweater or breaking in a pair of well-worn shoes. But with Alice and Amber, it had been immediate, a swift, warm rush of attachment. Now, as she sat beside their bed in the dimly lit room, she watched their eyes glisten with anticipation. Two pairs of tiny hands clutched her arm, tugging slightly as if her stories held the power to light up their dreams. "Please, Miss Diana, just one more story?" Alice's voice was a soft whisper, her brown eyes wide and hopeful. Diana chuckled, brushing a stray curl from Alice's forehead. "Sweetheart, it's really late. You've had enough stories for tonight. Besides, if your parents knew you were still up, they wouldn't be very happy now, would they?" Amber, always the bolder of the two, leaned forward with a mischievous smile. "But they're not home yet," she pointed out, clearly aware that this was her chance to prolong the magic a bit longer. "Just one more, please?" Diana sighed, pretending to be exasperated, but she could never resist their pleading faces. "All right, one more," she relented, holding up a finger, "but only if you promise to sleep after. Deal?" Two eager nods followed, and Diana settled back, her voice soft and soothing as she began another tale of enchanted forests and brave little girls who, against all odds, found courage within themselves. As she spoke, the girls' eyelids grew heavier, their hands loosening their grip on her arm. Yet, just as they were drifting into slumber, a faint noise echoed from outside, a soft, distant scraping sound. Diana's words faltered, and she glanced toward the window, heart racing. "Did you hear that noise?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Alice's eyes opened just a sliver. "Probably just Mr. Whiskers," she mumbled sleepily, referring to their scrappy cat, who often prowled around at night. Relieved, Diana chuckled. But unease prickled at the back of her mind. She brushed it off, tucking the girls under their blankets and placing a gentle kiss on each of their foreheads. "Good night, my brave little adventurers," she whispered. Turning off the lamp, Diana tiptoed toward the door, casting one last look at the twins nestled safely in their beds. Yet, as she closed the door, that faint noise surfaced again, louder this time, sending a chill down her spine. The house, usually a sanctuary, seemed suddenly alive with shadows and silence, a silence too heavy, pressing down with the weight of something unsaid, something waiting. In the dim hallway, Diana stood still, her senses on high alert. The twins' bedroom door was only a few steps away, and she felt her protective instincts flare up, sharpening every thought, every movement. She wanted to believe it was just the wind or the creak of the old house settling in the night, but something in her gut told her otherwise. She'd lived in too many places to ignore that instinct, that small but insistent pull at the edge of her consciousness. Quietly, she took a step forward, straining her ears, each step a testament to her growing dread. She'd always promised the twins she would protect them, and tonight, with darkness creeping closer, she knew she'd have to fulfill that promise in ways she hadn't expected. Diana paused mid-step, her gaze fixed down the shadowed hallway, listening intently as the sound resurfaced, this time louder, unmistakable. Her pulse quickened, a deep, rhythmic thrum in her chest, amplifying in the silence. It was a scratching, irregular and persistent, coming from somewhere near the back of the house. In the soft, familiar warmth of the Norris family home, this sound felt foreign, intrusive. Each tick and creak of the house, usually comforting, now seemed to hold a different energy, like it was holding its breath alongside her. She glanced back toward the twins' room, her mind flickering with thoughts of their peaceful, unaware faces. A strange resolve settled over her, she had to be sure. For their sake. Taking a quiet breath, she moved forward, slipping slowly down the hall, her footfalls muffled on the thick carpeting. Shadows seemed to shift along the walls as she passed, her eyes adjusting to the darkness. In the living room, she hesitated. The large bay window faced the back garden, and beyond its glass, night cloaked the world in a velvet blackness, only the faint outline of trees rustling in the breeze. She held her breath, listening again. The noise had stopped, replaced by a suffocating quiet. Diana found herself wishing Mr. and Mrs. Norris were home. They'd promised to be back by 10, yet here it was, Nearly midnight, and she was alone with a house that suddenly seemed too large, too empty. But as she strained her ears, another sound jolted her this time. It was the unmistakable creak of a floorboard from upstairs. Her heart pounded painfully against her ribs. Someone's inside. There was no denying it now. She felt her palms grow clammy as her mind raced, calculating her options. She couldn't risk alarming the twins. She couldn't risk letting this stranger near them. "Stay calm, Diana," she thought, swallowing her fear. Taking a step back, she returned to the hallway, retracing her path with measured, careful steps. She reached the twins' room, cracking the door just enough to see their peaceful forms, still asleep, breathing soft and even. But the noise continued, a second creak, now closer. Whoever it was, they were moving toward the bedrooms. Diana's hand trembled as she softly closed the door. She leaned against it for a moment, her mind pulsing with 1,000 thoughts. She had to find a way to keep the girls safe. Pressing her lips together, she took a shaky breath, gathering her courage. The fear was there, a cold weight in her stomach. But something fiercer rose to meet it, a protectiveness she hadn't known she possessed. Slowly, she edged back toward the stairway, peeking down into the entry hall below. Her fingers grazed the banister as she descended, each step a test of her nerve. She reached the base of the stairs, feeling the cool tiles beneath her bare feet, and froze as the noise continued, creeping closer. The kitchen door, slightly ajar, gave a faint creak, as if brushed by a gentle hand. She moved closer, pressing herself against the wall, heart hammering, listening to the soft shuffling sounds beyond. "One step closer and I'll see them," she thought, pulse pounding. Just as she mustered the nerve to peek around the corner, the shuffling stopped, replaced by the chilling silence once more. Her breathing sounded loud in her own ears, and a distant instinct told her not to reveal herself. Turning quickly, she headed back toward the twins' room, urgency in her steps now. She slipped inside quietly, reaching out to Amber, who stirred lightly, opening her eyes with a drowsy murmur. "Amber, sweetheart," Diana whispered, her voice as steady as she could manage. "Did you hear that sound?" The girl blinked sleepily and yawned, barely processing Diana's words. Was it Mr. Whiskers again? Diana forced a small smile. "Maybe, but I think it's better if we stay together, just in case." Her heart beat in her throat as she took a final glance around the dim room, pulling the girls' covers snug around them. Outside, the silence weighed heavy. The house, a place that once felt warm and secure, now felt like a dark, looming presence harboring shadows and secrets. Diana knew, without a doubt, that something was coming. The only question now was how much time they had left to prepare. As Diana sat in the dimly lit room, the low creak of another floorboard brought her heart to a sudden halt. She clutched the bedpost, the weight of dread settling over her like a dark, heavy blanket. Outside the door, the silence lingered too still, as though holding its breath alongside her. This isn't Mr. Whiskers, she thought, icy realization slipping over her. Someone was inside, and every fiber of her being urged her to protect the twins, no matter the cost. She glanced back at Alice and Amber, the girls still blissfully unaware, tucked snugly under their blankets. In that moment, their safety became her only thought. She forced a calming breath, her instincts sharpening into resolve as she whispered, "Amber, Alice, stay here. Don't move. I'll be right back, all right?" Amber's eyes fluttered open, a sleepy protest forming on her lips. But Diana pressed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "I just need to check on something. I won't be long. Stay quiet." Amber nodded reluctantly, her sister still sound asleep beside her. As Diana closed the door softly behind her, she felt the emptiness of the hallway stretch out like an endless chasm. The flickering shadows on the walls seemed to breathe with her, each one a reminder of the unknown presence lurking somewhere close by. Gathering her courage, she took a step forward, her senses on high alert. Just then, a shadow moved at the end of the hall, fleeting but undeniable. She froze, every muscle tensing. The figure was tall, cloaked in darkness, their features obscured but unmistakably human. Her breath caught, and for a brief, paralyzing moment she didn't know what to do. She'd never been in a situation like this, where every decision could mean the difference between safety and danger. The figure stepped forward, the faint light from the window illuminating the rough outline of a masked face. She could see the glint of eyes peering through the slits, watching her with a cold, unnerving focus. Every nerve in her body screamed at her to run, but her feet felt glued to the floor, locked in place by fear and disbelief. Who are you?" she stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. The intruder didn't answer, only tilted his head in a slow, chilling gesture, as if amused by her fear. In that heartbeat, she realized the girl's parents, Mr. and Mrs. Norris, weren't due back yet. They were still out, and she was alone, truly alone. The weight of that realization spurred her into action, and she took a step back, her mind racing. She needed to protect Alice and Amber, to keep them safe no matter what. And that meant distracting him, keeping him away from the twins' room. Summoning every ounce of courage she had, Diana turned and bolted down the stairs, her heart pounding, each step echoing loudly in the silence. She didn't dare look back, focusing instead on getting as far away from the girls as she could. But even as she ran, she heard the heavy footsteps behind her, steady and deliberate, the sound closing in with terrifying precision. She reached the bottom of the stairs and sprinted toward the kitchen, desperate for anything she could use to defend herself. A flash of metal caught her eye, a large, cast-iron skillet hanging from a hook by the stove. She grabbed it, the weight heavy and reassuring in her hands, and took a steadying breath. The footsteps stopped just beyond the kitchen doorway. A tense, fragile silence settled, thickening the air as she waited, her grip tightening on the skillet handle. Then, slowly, the figure stepped into view, his masked face angled toward her, a sinister calm in his stance. His voice, low and menacing, filled the silence. "There's no point in running," he drawled, his tone carrying a terrifying certainty. "You've got nowhere to go." Diana held her ground, her heart racing, her gaze locked on his. She could feel the tremor in her hands, the cold sweat on her brow, but she refused to let fear control her. She wasn't just fighting for herself, she was fighting for Alice and Amber. They depended on her now more than ever. Glaring defiantly at him, she raised the skillet, her voice steady and unyielding. "Maybe not," she replied, a spark of defiance in her eyes. "But I'm not going to make it easy for you." For a moment, they stood frozen, locked in a silent, unspoken battle of wills. Diana braced herself, ready to defend the children she loved, knowing she would do anything to keep them safe. Diana's pulse thundered in her ears as she stood her ground, skillet raised, ready to strike. But when the intruder took a step forward, she instinctively bolted to the side, dodging around him and sprinting back toward the stairs. She could feel him closing in behind her, each heavy footstep sending a fresh surge of panic through her. But then, almost miraculously, she saw an open closet door just down the hall. She dove inside, hoping to buy herself even a moment to think, a moment to breathe. She leaned back against the wall, desperately trying to steady her breath in the tight, dark space. It was then that she heard something, an almost imperceptible whimper from behind her. Turning slowly, she could just make out two shapes bound and hunched in the corner of the closet. Her breath caught as her eyes adjusted, recognizing Mr. and Mrs. Norris. They were gagged, wrists and ankles tightly tied, their faces pale and eyes wide with terror. "Oh my God," Diana gasped, kneeling down to reach for them, her hands shaking. She frantically began working at the knots on Mr. Norris's wrists, her fingers clumsy but determined. "Are you okay? Who did this to you?" Mr. Norris looked up at her with a desperate urgency in his eyes, shaking his head vigorously. Through the gag, he tried to speak, but only muffled sounds escaped. Mrs. Norris's gaze darted toward the closet door, her eyes widening in a silent warning. Diana froze, realizing what they were trying to tell her. The danger wasn't gone, it was still very much present. She stopped trying to untie them, sitting back on her heels, her mind racing. If she untied them now, they could be at even greater risk, especially if the intruder returned. But she couldn't just leave them here, helpless and terrified. Her gaze fell on Mrs. Norris's face, and she saw the deep worry etched in every line. It was a look she understood all too well. It was the look of a mother fearing for her children's lives. Diana leaned close to them, whispering, "The twins, Alice and Amber. They're okay, they're safe upstairs. I'll keep them safe, I promise." She could see relief soften Mrs. Norris's expression, even if only slightly. But then, a shadow fell over the doorway, and Diana's heart plummeted. The masked man was back. She pressed herself tightly against the wall, holding her breath, praying that he wouldn't see her in the dim light. She could hear his slow, methodical breathing as he took a step into the closet, pausing as though savoring their helplessness. For a horrifyingly long moment, the man simply stood there, watching Mr. and Mrs. Norris with a cold, calculating gaze. Diana felt her stomach twist as he muttered under his breath, "You thought you could hide it from me, all these years." pathetic. He stepped closer to Mr. Norris, crouching down so their faces were level. Mr. Norris's eyes glared with defiance, but Diana could see the desperation beneath his facade. The intruder's voice dripped with contempt as he continued. You and your secrets, you thought you were untouchable. Diana's fingers dug into her palms as she fought the impulse to intervene. She wanted so desperately to strike, to somehow free the Norrises and whisk them all away to safety. But she couldn't risk exposing herself now, not when the twins were counting on her. She held her breath, frozen in her hiding spot, waiting. After a tense silence, the man finally straightened, casting one last contemptuous glance at Mr. and Mrs. Norris. Then he turned, stepping back into the hallway. Diana waited, listening to his footsteps retreat down the stairs until she was certain he was out of earshot. In that brief, fragile moment of safety, she turned back to Mr. Norris, her voice barely a whisper. I'll get you out of here, both of you. But first, I have to make sure the girls are safe. Mr. Norris nodded, his eyes pleading, as if he understood her plan, as if he trusted her. Diana forced a reassuring smile, even though fear still gnawed at her. With one last, steadying breath, she slipped out of the closet and started toward the twins' room, determined to protect them at any cost. Diana moved cautiously, her body taut with tension, every sense heightened as she approached the twins' room. Her hand hovered over the doorknob, listening for any sound that would reveal the intruder's position. The house had fallen into an eerie silence, the kind that only served to sharpen her fear. She gently eased the door open and slipped inside, her gaze immediately landing on Alice and Amber, still huddled in their beds, unaware of the danger lurking around them. But before she could reach them, a shadow blocked the doorway, and Diana's heart stopped. She turned slowly, her blood running cold as she saw the masked figure filling the entrance. The light from the hallway cast a menacing glow over him, outlining the sharp edges of his frame. His eyes were visible through the mask, glinting with a dark amusement that made her stomach churn. Thought you could hide from me, he sneered, his voice low and mocking. You're braver than you look. I'll give you that. Diana felt her breath catch, but she stood her ground, positioning herself protectively in front of the twins. She could feel their presence just behind her, the soft sound of their breaths grounding her in that terrifying moment. Leave them out of this, she managed, her voice trembling but resolute. They're just children. You don't need to hurt them. The intruder laughed softly, the sound sending a chill down her spine. Oh, don't worry. This isn't about them, he said, taking a slow step forward, his eyes narrowing. This is about people who think they can just cast others aside. Diana's mind raced, piecing together fragments of his cryptic words. His anger was clearly directed at the Norrises, but whatever grudge he held didn't matter right now. All that mattered was keeping the twins safe. She took a deep breath, steadying herself, and forced herself to meet his gaze. Please, she said, her tone softening, trying to appeal to any scrap of humanity he might have. Just let us go. There's no reason to hurt anyone. But her words only seemed to amuse him further. He tilted his head, studying her as though she were a curious animal. It's too late for that, he replied, his voice cold, unyielding. They owe me, and tonight, I'm taking back what's mine. Diana's gaze flickered toward the window, measuring the distance and wondering if there was any way to get the girls to safety. She couldn't see a clear escape route, but she knew she had to try anything. With a fierce determination, she looked back at the intruder, a spark of defiance in her eyes. Then you'll have to get through me first, she said, her voice steady and unwavering. He seemed taken aback for a split second, surprised by her courage. But his shock quickly turned to a dark smile. If that's the way you want it, he replied, stepping forward. In that instant, Diana lunged, grabbing a nearby lamp from the dresser and swinging it toward him with all her strength. The lamp shattered on impact, sending pieces scattering across the room and forcing him to stumble back, momentarily thrown off balance. Diana seized the opportunity, yelling for the girls, Alice, Amber. Go, hide in the closet. The twins sprang into action, their faces pale with fear but their movements quick and obedient. They bolted to the closet, shutting the door just as the intruder regained his footing, his face now twisted in anger. He advanced on Diana, who grabbed the remnants of the broken lamp, holding the jagged base like a weapon. They stared each other down, a silent battle of wills raging between them. Diana's hands shook, but she stood firm, refusing to let fear consume her. She thought of the twins' small faces, their innocent trust in her, and her resolve hardened. She would protect them, no matter the cost. Just as he took another step forward, A loud banging echoed from downstairs, the sound of the front door bursting open, followed by voices shouting, "Police! This is the police! Show yourself!" The intruder's head snapped toward the doorway, his eyes flashing with fury. He shot Diana a final, venomous glare before retreating, slipping into the shadows and disappearing down the hallway. She sagged in relief, adrenaline leaving her weak-kneed as the reality of what had just happened washed over her. She rushed to the closet, pulling the doors open to find Alice and Amber huddled together, clutching each other with tear-streaked faces. Diana dropped to her knees, wrapping her arms around them and whispering reassurances. The police footsteps thundered through the house, and she held the twins close, feeling their warm, trembling forms in her embrace. "It's over," she murmured, a tremor in her voice but a weight lifted from her heart. "You're safe now, I promise." Even after the police had stormed in, the fear that gripped Diana didn't fully loosen. She held the twins tightly, her arms a shield around their small, trembling bodies. The warmth of their embrace, the way their little hands clung to her, gave her the strength to stay steady, to focus. She kept whispering reassurances, her voice soft but firm. "It's okay, I'm here. No one's going to hurt you." The police moved through the house, their muffled footsteps blending with the low hum of voices over crackling radios. Every noise, every distant sound, kept Diana's nerves on edge. She glanced around, her senses heightened, as though any shadow could still bring danger. Her protective instincts flared even stronger, a primal need to keep the girls safe, to stand between them and anything that might still lurk in the darkness. As the sounds of the police faded into other parts of the house, Alice stirred in her arms. Her eyes, wide and glassy, fixed on Diana's face, filled with questions and a lingering fear that tore at Diana's heart. "Miss Diana," Alice whispered, her small voice almost lost in the stillness. "Is the bad man gone?" Diana forced a smile, gently brushing a lock of hair from Alice's face. "Yes, sweetheart. The police are here now. They'll make sure he doesn't come back." Amber pressed close against Diana, buried her face in her shoulder, her fingers clutching tightly at Diana's shirt. "I was so scared," she murmured, her voice trembling. I thought he was going to get us." Diana's heart ached at the fear in Amber's voice. She hugged them both tighter, feeling a fierce surge of protectiveness. These girls were more than just children she cared for, they had become family to her, each moment spent with them building a bond she never anticipated but now cherished deeply. "It's okay to be scared," Diana whispered, her voice full of gentle reassurance. "But you were both so brave. And as long as I'm here, nothing bad will happen to you. I won't let anything hurt you ever." Amber lifted her head, looking up at Diana with a mix of admiration and relief. The girls seemed to draw strength from her words, their trembling gradually easing as they leaned into her, trusting her completely. Diana realized, at that moment, that she would do anything for them, no matter what. The thought barely had time to settle before the sound of footsteps approaching drew her attention. A police officer stepped into the room, his expression softened with concern as he looked at Diana and the twins huddled together. "Miss, the house is clear. We've secured the intruder outside. You're safe now." Diana nodded, feeling an immense relief, though her arms still tightened around Alice and Amber. She didn't want to let go, not yet. The events of the night had left an indelible mark, and in that instant, she knew this bond she shared with the girls had deepened beyond anything she could have imagined. "Thank you," she said, her voice filled with gratitude as she looked up at the officer, though her hands still protectively held the twins. The officer gave her a respectful nod, understanding the depth of her commitment to the children without needing words. As the night finally began to settle, Diana slowly released her hold, her gaze tender as she looked at Alice and Amber. "How about we go somewhere cozy, just the three of us?" she suggested, her voice soft. "I think we could all use a bit of calm." The girls nodded, relief mixing with exhaustion on their faces. Diana rose, taking their hands, and led them down the hall, her heart swelling with a renewed sense of purpose and love. As they moved toward the safety and warmth of the family room, she felt the weight of her promise settle within her, a promise she intended to keep forever. For Diana, this night had transformed something within her, strengthening her resolve to protect these girls not just because it was her job, but because they were her family in every way that mattered. In the quiet moments that followed, she held them close, offering them the comfort and security they needed, while within herself she carried the certainty that she would never let anything harm them again. The early hours of the morning wrapped the house in a quiet, fragile calm, yet sleep was far from the minds of Alice and Amber. They sat curled up with Diana in the family room, warm blankets around them, each holding on to her as if she were a lifeline. Despite the harrowing events of the night, there was a glimmer of something else in their eyes, a quiet bravery, a resilient spark that hadn't been there before. Diana could see it clearly as she gazed at the girls, her heart swelling with a mix of pride and love. She gave Amber's hand a gentle squeeze. "You two were so brave tonight. Do you know that?" Alice glanced at her sister, then looked back at Diana with a mixture of surprise and pride. We just wanted to make sure you were safe," she said softly, her voice steadying with each word. "When we heard the noises, we thought maybe you needed us." Diana felt her eyes prickle with tears, and she pulled them both a little closer. "I don't think I could have made it through the night without you," she whispered, her voice full of sincerity. "You two were the real heroes." Amber, her usual boldness now softened by the night's events, leaned her head on Diana's shoulder. "I was scared," she admitted in a small voice, her fingers fidgeting with the edge of the blanket. "But I kept thinking of you and Alice. I didn't want the bad man to hurt you." Diana's heart ached as she stroked Amber's hair gently, her touch soothing. "Being brave doesn't mean not being scared, sweetheart," she said, her voice tender. "It means doing the right thing, even when you are scared. And you both did that. You stayed strong, and you listened to me when it mattered most. That's true bravery." Amber's eyes shimmered, her expression brightening a bit as she looked up at Diana. "You're the bravest of all, Miss Diana," she replied, her tone filled with admiration. "You didn't let him hurt us, you protected us." Diana felt a lump form in her throat. She realized how much they truly trusted her, how much they believed in her. She was more than just their nanny now. She was someone they saw as a protector, a guiding presence in their lives. The weight of that responsibility was something she embraced fully, knowing it came from the deepest part of her heart. Alice, sensing the warmth in the room, gave a small smile and added, "We were brave because you taught us to be brave." She looked at Amber, then back at Diana. "We wanted to make you proud." Diana could only pull them closer, her own fears and anxieties fading in the face of their resilience. "You did, Alice, you both did. I couldn't be prouder." They sat together for a while in silence, the early light beginning to filter through the curtains, casting a soft glow around them. Despite the lingering shadows of the night, a new feeling settled in, one of safety, comfort, and the knowledge that they had faced their fears together. As the sun slowly rose, bringing with it the promise of a new day, the twins' bravery became a cherished memory for Diana. It was a reminder of how strong they were, how resilient children could be, and how deeply they loved and trusted her. In their quiet, steadfast way, they had taught her as much about bravery as she had taught them. With a soft sigh, Diana smoothed back their hair, feeling their warmth against her. "Let's get some rest now, my brave ones," she murmured. "Tomorrow will be better, and together we'll be stronger." The twins nodded, their eyes growing heavy with sleep, yet still clinging to her, their fingers wrapped tightly around hers. In those final moments before they drifted off, Diana knew this night would forever bond them. They had faced something dark, and together they had come out on the other side, finding strength in each other that would carry them through anything life might bring. And as Alice and Amber's breathing slowed, Diana felt her own sense of peace settle within her, knowing that no matter what, she would always be there for them, just as they had been there for her. The warmth and comfort they had just shared were short-lived. As the dawn began to filter softly through the windows, Diana heard a faint sound outside, the crunch of footsteps on gravel, far too close for comfort. Her body tensed, instincts flaring once more. The police may have captured one intruder, but the night's terror hadn't ended. Another figure, perhaps an accomplice, lurked outside. She turned to the twins, their small faces still etched with a lingering fear. "Girls," she whispered, her voice barely above a breath, "we need to go outside. Quietly. Do you understand?" Alice and Amber nodded, their expressions shifting from exhaustion to quiet resolve. They trusted her, and that trust gave Diana the strength to stay calm. Taking each of their hands, she led them to the back door, easing it open as silently as possible. The early morning chill wrapped around them as they slipped out into the yard, the air thick with dew and the faint smell of earth. Diana guided them toward the back corner of the yard, her mind racing for a hiding place. Just beyond the lawn stood a familiar sanctuary, the twins' beloved treehouse. It was partially hidden among the thick branches, its wooden slats camouflaged in the early light. "Come on," she whispered, giving their hands a reassuring squeeze. We're going to hide in your treehouse. No matter what happens, stay quiet and stay together." They moved across the yard as silently as they could, the soft grass cushioning their footsteps. Shadows from the surrounding trees stretched across the lawn, each one seeming to reach out toward them. Diana's heartbeat thudded in her ears, every rustle of the leaves amplified in the tense silence. They reached the base of the tree, and she hoisted Alice up first, the older twin scrambling up the ladder with surprising agility. Amber followed, glancing back at Diana as she climbed, her eyes wide but determined. Diana climbed up last, feeling the rough wood beneath her hands, each rung of the ladder a lifeline as they ascended into their temporary shelter. Once inside, she carefully pulled the small trapdoor shut, positioning herself in front of the girls, ready to shield them if necessary. They huddled close, pressed against each other, their breathing soft but quick. The minutes ticked by, and Diana could hear the faint sound of footsteps again, closer this time, moving across the yard. She held her breath, keeping her arms wrapped protectively around Alice and Amber. The silence hung heavy, broken only by the occasional crunch of gravel or rustle of leaves. As the footsteps approached the base of the tree, Diana felt her heart skip. She glanced at the twins, giving them a silent nod, her eyes promising that she would protect them. Amber's small hand found hers, giving it a gentle squeeze, a tiny gesture of solidarity, a reminder that they were all in this together. The intruder's shadow fell over the base of the treehouse, and Diana felt her body go rigid. She didn't dare move, barely even breathing as she listened, every sense on high alert. Amber whispered softly to her sister, "Don't move," her voice a barely audible breath. Diana placed a finger to her lips, signaling for absolute silence, and they waited, frozen in place. The intruder's presence lingered just below, the shadow stretching long across the grass. Diana's mind raced with plans, any possible escape route or defense she could muster if they were discovered. The thought of the girls' safety filled her with a fierce, unwavering courage. Finally, after what felt like hours, the footsteps began to retreat, moving away from the treehouse and back toward the house. Diana's muscles relaxed, relief flooding through her, but she stayed still, unwilling to move too soon. They waited in silence, the cool air wrapping around them as the sky slowly brightened with the promise of day. Diana looked at the twins, giving them an encouraging smile. "We're safe," she whispered, her voice steady. "You both did wonderfully. I'm so proud of you." The girls nodded, their expressions a mix of relief and exhaustion, but a quiet strength radiated from them. Huddled together in that small space, Diana knew they had faced something extraordinary. They had confronted their fears and emerged, together, finding strength and courage that would stay with them long after this night was over. Diana sat in the cramped treehouse, her heart pounding, every sense sharp as she listened to the fading footsteps of the intruder. The soft rustling of the leaves above and the occasional bird call were the only sounds breaking the oppressive silence. Alice and Amber sat close to her, their eyes wide with fear, yet there was a palpable sense of courage that radiated from them both. They had come so far, stayed so strong, but Diana knew they couldn't stay hidden forever. The minutes felt like hours. Diana knew they couldn't wait any longer. She had to act. The longer they stayed hidden, the greater the chance the intruder would return, or worse, find another way to get to them. The weight of the responsibility pressed down on her chest. She couldn't risk the girls being hurt. Not while she was here, not while she still had the strength to protect them. She glanced down at the twins, their eyes watching her with unwavering trust, and her heart swelled. They were depending on her, and she would not let them down. Diana made a quiet vow to herself. No matter what, she would get them to safety. The plan she had in mind wasn't perfect, but it was the only one that made sense in that moment. "Girls," Diana whispered, her voice soft but firm, "we need to move. We're going to make a run for the garage. The family car should be there. We can get out. But we have to be quiet, and we have to move fast. Understand?" Both Alice and Amber nodded, their faces set with a determination that mirrored Diana's. They were ready. They had made it through the worst of it already, and now they just needed to keep moving forward. Diana gave them both one last squeeze before climbing out of the treehouse, her feet landing lightly on the ground. She looked around, ensuring the coast was clear. The yard was bathed in the soft glow of the early morning light, still shrouded in a heavy mist that made everything look uncertain, dreamlike. It felt as though they were moving through a world that was no longer fully theirs, where shadows moved and the familiar had turned strange. She motioned for Alice to follow, and they made their way toward the house, sticking to the edge of the yard to avoid being seen from the windows. Diana felt the sharpness of every sound, the soft crunch of their footsteps on the gravel, the quickening rhythm of her own breath. Her eyes flicked constantly from side to side, watching for any sign of the intruder. They reached the side of the house without incident, and Diana's eyes scanned the area for any sign of movement. Nothing. But then, just as they approached the back door, a shrill ringing shattered the silence. Her heart skipped a beat. The phone line. The phone in Mr. Norris's office had been her last hope to call for help, but she knew the intruder had severed the line. And yet, the phone's ring continued. Diana's pulse spiked as she realized that the phone signal must still be alive somehow. Without a second thought, Diana made a quick decision. She motioned for the twins to wait by the door. "Stay here," she ordered gently, "I'll be right back." She rushed into the house, her body moving on instinct, every nerve firing, as she made her way through the dark hallway. She reached Mr. Norris's office in record time, heart pounding, praying that the phone wasn't just some cruel false hope. Her fingers fumbled with the receiver, her hands slick with sweat, as she yanked the cord off the hook. For a moment, the silence felt suffocating. Then there was a dial tone, clear, insistent. Diana's heart surged with relief. She wasted no time dialing the emergency number, her voice trembling as she spoke into the receiver. "Please," she gasped, "we need help. There's someone in the house, he's still here. Please, hurry." The operator's calm voice on the other end was a lifeline. "We've got units on the way. Stay on the line. Do you know where the intruder is?" Diana's mind raced, but just as she opened her mouth to respond, the unmistakable sound of footsteps echoed from the hallway, growing louder by the second. She glanced quickly toward the door, and her heart froze. The intruder was back. She had no time to waste. "Get to the garage," she whispered urgently into the receiver before slamming down the phone. Her thoughts were a blur of motion as she rushed back toward the twins. They couldn't wait any longer. Every second counted. Diana's heart pounded in her chest as she sprinted back toward the garage, her mind racing through every possible scenario. The phone call had been brief, and there was no time to waste. The intruder was closing in. She had to get the twins to safety before he found them again. The garage loomed ahead, its large doors partially open, the cool morning air swirling through the cracks. Diana slowed as she approached, her senses on high alert. She glanced back, making sure the twins were close behind her, and then she motioned for them to hurry. "Stay close," she whispered urgently, "and don't make a sound." Alice and Amber nodded, their eyes wide but resolute, clinging to Diana's side as they followed her into the dimly lit garage. The familiar scent of motor oil and sawdust filled the air, but it did nothing to ease the tension in Diana's chest. She needed to think fast. They couldn't stay here long. Diana glanced around, her gaze landing on the family car parked near the back. Her heart skipped a beat. It was their only way out. She rushed over to the driver's side, her hands shaking as she fumbled with the keys in her pocket. The sound of her movements felt unnaturally loud in the heavy silence that surrounded them. "Please start," she whispered to herself, her breath coming out in short, sharp gasps as she twisted the key in the ignition. The engine sputtered for a moment before roaring to life, the sound breaking the stillness and filling her with a sudden burst of hope. She quickly turned around to face the girls. "We're leaving now," she said, her voice steady, though her heart was racing. "Get in the car. Hurry." Alice and Amber scrambled into the backseat without hesitation, their small hands gripping the seat as Diana quickly buckled them in. The tension in the air felt suffocating, but Diana forced herself to remain calm. The engine hummed steadily, but her nerves were anything but. Just as she slid into the driver's seat, she heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps, heavy, deliberate, and unmistakably close. Her heart sank. The intruder was nearly there. "Come on," she muttered under her breath, her hands gripping the steering wheel. She wasn't about to let him stop them now. With a quick glance over her shoulder to ensure the girls were safely secured, she pressed her foot down on the gas pedal. The car lurched forward, its tires squealing as it shot out of the garage and into the open driveway. But before she could even pull out onto the street, a loud crash sounded from behind her. The garage door slammed shut, and she knew, without a doubt, the intruder had reached the house. Diana's pulse spiked as she floored the accelerator, the car surging forward, tires skidding on the gravel driveway. She glanced quickly in the rearview mirror, her breath caught in her throat as she saw the silhouette of the intruder, silhouetted against the garage door. He was still coming. Hold on," Diana shouted as the car rocketed down the driveway, her hands tightening on the wheel. She focused only on getting away, on getting the girls as far from the danger as possible. The road ahead was long, and every second mattered. The sound of the car's engine grew louder, the engine straining as she pushed it faster, the house and the threat receding into the distance. The sound of Alice's and Amber's nervous giggles in the backseat cut through the tension like a welcome breeze. Diana's heart clenched in relief, but she didn't dare slow down. Not yet. Not until they were safe. "We're okay," Diana reassured them, though her voice was tight with barely contained fear. "We're going to be okay." The silence that followed was no longer one of dread but of exhausted relief. The twins, once trembling and uncertain, had begun to relax, their tight grips on the seat loosening as they let themselves believe in the safety Diana had promised them. Diana didn't dare look back, her hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly that her knuckles were white. They were on their way to safety, but a part of her couldn't shake the feeling that, no matter how far they went, the night's terror would follow them until it was truly over. But for now, she had done what she promised, she had protected them. And for the first time that night, she allowed herself to believe that everything would be all right. Diana's heart thundered in her chest as she drove, the headlights cutting through the thick morning mist. The road ahead feeling like the only thing keeping them safe. But the closer they got to the end of the driveway, the more Diana felt that all too familiar weight pressing down on her. There was still danger looming, still that cold sense of urgency that would not let her rest. She had to get them farther, somewhere no one could find them, no one could hurt them. As she took the sharp turn out of the driveway, her mind raced, thinking of their next move. The road stretched out before her, but she could feel a sense of vulnerability creeping over her. The car, for all its power, wasn't a fortress. She had to think ahead. She had to think like a protector, like a mother. She pulled over to the side of the road, the gravel crunching beneath the tires as the car came to a halt. The engine idled quietly, a stark contrast to the pounding of her heart. She glanced at the twins in the rearview mirror, their wide eyes full of uncertainty, but also trust in her ability to keep them safe. "We're not going far," Diana said, her voice low but steady. "But we need to make sure we're really safe before we go any further." The twins nodded, but Diana could see the lingering fear in their eyes. They'd been through so much already, too much for kids their age. She reached back, brushing Amber's hair out of her face, and gave Alice a reassuring smile. "Stay here for a moment. I'm just going to check out the house, make sure no one's following us." As Diana stepped out of the car, the cool night air hit her, and the sharp scent of pine mixed with the dampness of the soil beneath her boots. She walked around the car, keeping her eyes peeled for anything suspicious. But the quiet of the countryside was unnerving, too quiet. Her nerves were frayed, but she pushed those thoughts away. She couldn't afford to panic, not now, not when the twins needed her most. With a quick glance at the house behind her, she made her decision. They couldn't stay here, not when she wasn't sure if the danger had passed. The intruder could still be out there, lurking in the shadows. They needed to be one step ahead, out of sight, somewhere they couldn't be found. Diana turned back to the car, her mind already working, already planning their next move. She approached the back of the car, her voice just above a whisper. "Girls, we have to go. We can't stay here. Let's go to the back of the house through the window. It's the safest way." The twins nodded, their faces pale but resolute. They were following her every command now, trusting her instinctively. Diana opened the back door and motioned for the girls to follow her, stepping quietly across the ground toward the side of the house. "Stay low," she instructed, her voice barely audible, her heart hammering in her chest. "We're going in through the window." She reached for the window ledge, her hands shaking with the strain of trying to remain calm, to remain in control. She tugged gently at the window, praying it would open without making too much noise. The window creaked loudly and she froze, holding her breath. Her mind raced. Had someone heard that? Was the intruder still nearby? After a few agonizing seconds, the window gave way, sliding open with a barely audible click. Diana's heart leapt. She gestured for Alice and Amber to climb through first, helping them into the house. Once they were both inside, Diana followed swiftly, closing the window behind her with quiet precision. She turned, scanning the room. The air was still and thick with the weight of everything they had just escaped from. "We'll be okay," Diana whispered to herself, more to calm her own nerves than anything else. The house, though dark and silent, felt safer now. It felt like a temporary refuge, a place where they could regroup, a place where they could breathe. She moved toward the front door, checking the locks and pulling the curtains tightly closed. But just as she was about to turn back to the twins, a faint sound broke the silence. A door creaked downstairs. Diana's breath caught in her throat. The intruder. Had he found them? Would they be safe here, even for a moment longer? She grabbed the girls by the hand and led them up the stairs, her mind working frantically as they moved. She had to think of something, anything to keep them safe. The house was isolated, but that also made them vulnerable. There was no telling how much time they had left before someone came looking. The quiet footsteps downstairs grew louder. Diana's heart pounded with one thought: they needed to get out. Fast. The house was eerily quiet as Diana stood near the stairs, her ears straining to listen for any sound. The distant creak of the door downstairs was still echoing in her mind, but it was followed by a suffocating silence. Her heart pounded in her chest, and a cold sweat had begun to form on the back of her neck. The urgency to escape was becoming overwhelming, but her mind raced through a dozen possible plans, none of them perfect. With one last glance at the girls, still huddled close behind her, Diana knew the decision had been made. They couldn't wait here anymore. She could feel the weight of the intruder's presence closing in on them, and she couldn't risk it. The car was their only chance. If she could just get them back to it, out of the house, down the driveway, and away from danger, they might finally be safe. She quickly moved to the window, pulling back the curtains just enough to peek outside. The driveway was still empty, the faint light of the early morning barely illuminating the gravel. No sign of the intruder yet, but they couldn't wait for him to make the first move. They had to go now. "Girls," Diana said softly, her voice calm but filled with the weight of what was to come, "we're going to make a run for it. We're going to get to the car, and we're leaving. Stay close and stay quiet." Alice and Amber nodded, their faces filled with both fear and determination. They trusted her, their eyes filled with a quiet strength that made Diana's resolve harden. They were ready. They had been through so much already together, as a team, and now it was time to take action. Diana led them down the hallway, her steps careful, every creak of the old wood beneath their feet feeling like an explosion in the silence. As they reached the back door, Diana hesitated, peering out through the crack in the door to ensure the coast was clear. She breathed a sigh of relief. Nothing. The yard was still empty, and for a moment, the weight on her shoulders seemed to lessen. "Okay, let's go," Diana whispered urgently. She pushed the door open just wide enough for them to slip through, motioning for Alice and Amber to step outside first. The chill of the morning air hit her like a cold slap, but it was a welcome reminder of the fresh chance they had. They moved quickly, stepping lightly across the yard, barely making a sound as they crossed the grass. The car wasn't far now, parked just a few yards away under the cover of the trees, but it felt like miles. Diana's heart was racing, and her breath came in shallow gasps as she moved them forward, one step at a time. Once they reached the car, Diana wasted no time. She opened the back door for the twins, and they climbed in quickly, their small bodies trembling but determined. Diana didn't even pause to buckle them in before getting into the driver's seat. She was already reaching for the ignition, her hands shaking, but she managed to get the key into the slot and turn it. The engine sputtered once, then twice. Her breath caught in her throat. The car had never taken so long to start. The seconds felt like hours. She turned the key again, praying it would start. And then, finally, the engine roared to life. But just as Diana's relief washed over her, a faint sound in the distance sent a jolt of terror through her. Footsteps. They were coming closer. The unmistakable crunch of gravel under heavy boots grew louder, and Diana knew they didn't have much time. She slammed the car into reverse, her foot pressing hard on the gas. The tires squealed as they spun, struggling against the gravel for grip. The car jerked backward, its engine growling, but just as she thought they were free, it lurched forward, stalling. Panic surged in her chest as she tried again, her hands slick with sweat. This time, the engine roared to life, and the car shot forward, the gravel skidding beneath the tires. Diana glanced in the rearview mirror, her heart in her throat as the shadow of the intruder appeared in the driveway, just in time to see them drive away. Her foot pushed the gas pedal down harder, her hands gripping the wheel with a fierce determination. The house and the intruder disappeared behind them, but Diana didn't dare slow down, not yet. She couldn't afford to. not when they were so close but still so vulnerable. Diana's grip on the steering wheel tightened as the car raced down the narrow road, the tires kicking up dust behind them. The trees blurred past in a flurry of green and brown, and the rhythmic pounding of her heart was the only sound that seemed real. She kept her eyes locked on the road ahead, her mind focused on getting as far away as possible. The threat was still real, still looming, but for now they were moving, escaping. The headlights cast long shadows across the road, but Diana knew she couldn't relax. The intruder could still be out there, waiting, watching. She glanced nervously at the rearview mirror, half expecting to see headlights creeping up behind her. The drive felt endless, and every turn she made seemed to add another mile between them and the nightmare they'd just left behind. And then, just as the weight of her nerves began to settle, the flashing red and blue lights of a police car appeared in the distance, rapidly approaching. Diana's breath caught in her throat. She had been so focused on escaping that she hadn't noticed the sirens until now. Relief washed over her, but it was tempered with a lingering sense of caution. She had no idea what kind of trouble they were about to face, but the police were here. At least that meant they were no longer alone. She slowed the car, pulling over to the side of the road. The police car screeched to a halt beside her, the lights flashing in a frantic dance. Diana rolled down her window, her hands still trembling as she tried to calm herself. "Are you okay?" A police officer's voice called out from the side of the vehicle, his voice loud and clear over the hum of the sirens. Diana nodded, swallowing her fear as she turned to look at the twins, who had finally settled, their wide eyes still filled with the lingering fear of the night. She gave them a reassuring smile before she turned her focus back to the officer. "We're fine," she said, her voice shakier than she wanted to admit. "But there's an intruder. He was in the house. He's the one who did this." The officer nodded, his expression hardening. "We know. We've been chasing him for a while now. He's not getting away." Just as the officer spoke, the sound of another police car echoed in the distance, its sirens blaring. Diana felt a moment of relief at the growing presence of law enforcement, but her attention shifted back to the officer as he turned to look at the other squad car. "We have a description," he said, his voice firm. "He's not getting far." Diana felt her breath steadying as the officer turned back to her. "Are you sure you're all right? We'll take it from here. We'll handle the rest." Diana nodded again, her throat tight with emotion. She glanced back at the twins, offering them one more smile before the officer ushered them to the side of the road. The officers began to organize, communicating with each other in hushed voices. A sense of authority settled over them, and Diana couldn't help but feel a small flicker of hope. Minutes passed, but they felt like hours. Diana sat in the car, her hands still gripping the steering wheel, her mind racing. What if the intruder had gotten away? What if they were still in danger? The uncertainty clawed at her, but there was nothing more she could do. She had done all she could. The police had arrived, and now it was their turn to take control. Suddenly, the sound of a walkie-talkie crackled over the officer's shoulder. The words that followed were almost drowned out by the rush of blood in Diana's ears, but she caught enough to understand. "We've got him," the officer said, his voice firm with conviction. "He's been caught. He's not going anywhere." Diana's breath hitched as the full weight of the moment sank in. The intruder was caught. He wouldn't hurt them again. The fear that had gripped her for so long was finally, truly beginning to loosen its hold. The officer turned to her, his face softening. "You did the right thing. You got your family out of there. You're safe now." Diana felt a lump rise in her throat. For the first time in hours, she allowed herself to exhale. She looked back at the twins, their faces still wide with confusion, but a sense of calm settling in their small bodies. They were safe. They had made it. The officer's words echoed in her mind. "You're safe now." And for the first time that night, Diana allowed herself to believe it. The air around them seemed to shift, a palpable relief filling the space as Diana sat in the police car, watching the officers carefully bring the intruder into custody. He was handcuffed, his movements sluggish, as if defeated by the overwhelming force of the law. Diana's mind reeled with the events of the night, the terror, the fear, and the overwhelming sense of duty that had driven her every move. She had never expected to be in a situation like this. Yet here she was, standing on the other side of it, the weight of the danger still heavy in her chest, but slowly lightening as the minutes passed. Her eyes scanned the scene, finding the familiar faces of Mr. and Mrs. Norris standing nearby, their expressions a mixture of exhaustion and gratitude. The officers had managed to get them untied earlier, and now they were standing together, holding onto each other like two souls who had survived a storm. Diana's heart swelled as she watched them. She approached them slowly, her feet still shaky from the night's adrenaline, and the Norris's eyes softened as they saw her. "Diana," Mrs. Norris exclaimed, rushing forward to wrap her arms around her. "You did it. You kept them safe." Diana stood still for a moment, surprised by the wave of emotion that hit her. Mrs. Norris's embrace was tight, filled with gratitude and warmth that Diana hadn't expected. "I was just doing my job," Diana said, her voice thick with emotion, her eyes welling up as she pulled back slightly to look at them. I couldn't let anything happen to the girls." Mr. Norris stepped forward, his face serious but soft with appreciation. "You did more than that. You saved our family, Diana. Without you, I don't know what would have happened." Diana felt a lump form in her throat, but she swallowed it down, her voice steady but quiet. "I'm just glad you're all okay." Mr. Norris's hand rested on her shoulder, and his gaze was unwavering. "You're more than just a nanny to us. You're family. And I want you to know that. I don't have the words, but I want to make sure you know how deeply grateful we are." Mrs. Norris nodded, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "We can't thank you enough. You've been there for our children when we couldn't be, and tonight you saved them. You saved all of us." Diana's breath caught in her throat. She had always known that her work with the twins was important, but in that moment, she realized just how deep her bond with the Norrises had gone. They weren't just the family she worked for, they were the family she had chosen to protect, and they had done the same for her. "We want to show our appreciation," Mr. Norris continued, his tone steady. "We've been thinking for a while now, and after tonight, we know that you're more than just someone who helps out. You're part of our family. Diana, we want to offer you something more. A position not just as a nanny, but as a partner in our business. You've earned it, and we want you to have it. You're invaluable to us." Diana stood frozen, unable to process the words. A partner in their business. The idea seemed so surreal, but she could see the sincerity in their eyes. They weren't just offering her a promotion, they were offering her something far more meaningful, a place in their lives, not just as an employee, but as someone they cared for deeply. "I don't know what to say," Diana finally managed, her voice trembling with the overwhelming emotion of it all. "I never expected this. You've already given me so much." Mrs. Norris smiled, taking Diana's hands in hers. "You've given us everything, Diana. More than we could ever ask for." Tears welled up in Diana's eyes as she looked at the Norrises. The weight of everything that had happened, the terror, the close calls, the pain seemed to fall away, replaced by a warmth that flooded her chest. She had feared for so long that she would always be an outsider, always someone on the edge of someone else's family. But here, now, she realized that she wasn't. "I'll do everything I can to help," Diana said softly, her voice filled with newfound confidence. "I'll always be here for you just as you've been there for me." And in that moment, Diana knew that this wasn't just a job anymore. It was home. This was where she belonged. As the days turned into weeks, the shadow of the night's terror slowly faded, replaced by a sense of peace that Diana hadn't felt in a long time. The Norrises, despite the trauma they had endured, became a stronger, more connected family, and Diana found herself woven deeper into the fabric of their lives. The girls, Alice and Amber, were back to their playful selves, but there was a new maturity in their eyes, a quiet understanding of the world around them. They had seen the worst of it, but Diana had given them something even more precious, a sense of safety, of belonging. And Diana, she had found something she never expected: her place in the world, not just as a caretaker, but as an integral part of the family she had come to love so deeply. The transition wasn't immediate, but over time, Diana stepped into her new role with confidence. Mr. and Mrs. Norris had made their offer clear. They saw her not just as an employee, but as a partner. Diana was no longer simply the nanny. She was now part of something bigger, something that went beyond the walls of the house and the confines of a job. She had become a pillar in their family's business, a trusted confidante, and a person they leaned on in times of both joy and hardship. The work was challenging, but Diana found it rewarding. With every new project, every meeting, and every decision made alongside the Norrises, she felt herself growing not just as a professional, but as a person. She had learned, through the horrors of that one night, what it meant to fight for something and how to never take anything for granted. Diana's role in the family business grew. She was no longer just managing the household, she was helping shape the company's direction, bringing in new ideas, and even handling client relationships. Her creativity and business acumen, which she had kept hidden for so long, began to flourish. The Norrises didn't just see her as a helper, they recognized her value as a partner and a leader. With their support, Diana felt empowered in ways she had never known before. One afternoon, as Diana walked through the large open-plan office, she looked out the window and saw Alice and Amber playing in the yard. The sun was setting behind them, casting long golden shadows across the lawn. It was a perfect moment of peace, the kind she had feared she would never experience after that night. But now, everything had changed. Diana had made it. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was thriving. The relationship she had with the twins had deepened, and her bond with the Norrises had transformed from one employer and employee to that of family unspoken, unbreakable. As she turned to leave the office, Mr. Norris stepped into the hallway, his usual businesslike demeanor softened by the warmth in his eyes. He caught her gaze and gave her a small, appreciative nod. "You've changed everything for us, Diana," he said quietly, his voice full of sincerity. "You've not only saved us that night, you've helped build us into something stronger, something better. You're a part of this family, now, in every sense of the word." Diana felt a lump form in her throat as she looked at him, his words sinking deep into her heart. She had never expected this, never imagined that one act of courage could lead to so much transformation. But, as she stood there, surrounded by the warmth of the family she had protected, she knew she was exactly where she was meant to be. She smiled, her heart full of gratitude. "Thank you, for everything." And in that moment, Diana understood something profound. She had come full circle. She had been the one to protect, but in doing so, she had found protection in return. She had found a family. And with that, the weight of the past lifted, replaced by a future full of hope, love, and the strength to face whatever came next.